Welcome to another episode of Insights from the Trenches, a series dedicated to helping ADHD couples thrive by empowering couples with insights from ADHD experts and ADHD peers. I'm Alice, your host. In today's episode, I'm excited to talk with Dr. Lyne Piché, a psychologist who specializes in ADHD and sexuality, on the topic of ADHD and sex. She recently released ADHD and Sex, a workbook designed to help ADHD individuals and couples better understand their unique experiences with desire and intimacy. So grab a cup of coffee and let's thrive together.
So, Lynn, thank you
Hi,
so much. It's good to see you today.
it's lovely to see
So,
you too. So glad to be
yes,
here.
yes. Can you introduce a little bit about yourself and your ADHD journey?
Sure. So my name is Dr. Lyne Piché, and I'm a registered psychologist. I live and work and grew up in Canada. Let's see, my ADHD journey. Well, that's been quite a journey. I think, like many women, there was a long time where ADHD certainly wasn't on my radar in regards to how I was functioning or what was necessary to get through life. I've always loved people and behavior and sexuality and all of these things that have captured my attention, pretty much throughout my life and throughout my career. So when I was diagnosed later in life as having ADHD, it made a lot of things make sense to me in regards to how I live and this like passion and interest in some of the topics that are important to me. And so it's been a meandering journey, I would say, and definitely had its highs and lows. But overall, I've been very lucky to work with people and to do work that I really, really enjoy. So, wow, that's a bit about me.
Thanks for sharing a little bit about yourself and your ADHD journey. What inspired you to specialize in ADHD and sex therapy?
Well, it's really interesting. I've worked as a sex therapist for a long time. I've worked as a psychologist for a long time. I think it's been 26 years now, which is crazy that I've been running a practice. And so sexual health and sexuality was always really important to me. And when I was younger, we had Dr. Ruth and Dr. Sue Johnson that would be, on the radio and talking about sexuality. And I always thought, oh, that is so cool, right? These people who are out there and normalizing and validating people's experience and just being willing to talk about something that in the 70s and 80s was not always talked about as easily or as openly as it is today. And so there's a lot of people that I looked up to in their careers and how they were managing sexuality. And having spent my life kind of working with sexual issues, when I did start getting to know ADHD and following my own diagnosis and looking at what was happening in the family system and trying to figure some things out, just asking questions about, oh, well, this makes perfect sense, this whole business of how ADHD impacts sexuality. And I started looking and talking to and trying to find out who is talking about this, who's teaching about ADHD and sex. And when I first started looking into this, I was looking for a mentor. And I'm like, well, obviously, in the ADHD community, we're talking about sexuality. I found that there really weren't a lot of people having that conversation. Dr. Ari Tuckman's got a book on the subject, and there's a few people talking about it, but it just seemed to me that there was this real big gap. And because it made so much sense to me getting to know ADHD and what that looked like in my practice around sexual health with many, many people, I started kind of putting some of these things together and looking at the research and going, why are we not talking about this? And not just from a research perspective, but more concretely, like, what do you do with this? How do you understand this? And it's interesting when you have undiagnosed ADHD, there's all these stories that you tell yourself about why you're doing certain things or how come things are happening. And they don't necessarily align with what the actual reasons is or what's actually going on for you. And so as I was really working on this and getting to know the research, I realized that we needed a way to start talking to people, couples, individuals, so that they could start understanding how their ADHD was impacting their sexuality, how if you're partnered with somebody with ADHD, what that might look like in regards to sexual health, and some of the conversations that might be helpful to have. And of course, I get very excited about things, and so created this passion project and wrote a workbook on what to do with this problem and how to start thinking about it. And so the last few years, or I guess last couple of years, I've been just teaching and talking about it and putting together courses so that we can have a platform in which to have the conversation, both as clinicians, so that clinicians can start talking about this and really understanding how these things come together, but also for people who are living with this every day to have that vocabulary, right? That way to start talking about how this comes together and how that can be helpful for you. So that's kind of the journey, really, was, my own journey, and then looking at some of the things I'd learned in life and wanting to share that with other people.
That sounds great. So help me understand a little bit about what are the most common challenges that ADHD brings to a couple's relationship around like sexuality and things like that.
Well, ADHD and, just neurodiversity in general is very unique, right? And I know you guys all know this, like this idea of, well, it kind of depends on how it's being expressed in you. And it's kind of the same thing with sex. So when you think about attention being variable, I can be super hyper focused on something, I can be super like not interested in it at all. These variations. We also see those same variations in ADHD communities when it relates to sex. And so you will have ADHDers that are very, very hyper focused on sex and interested in it. And there's actually like a moderate correlation. So there's this link between ADHD and hypersexuality. But we also have some people in the ADHD community who aren't interested in sex at all, who are like, you know what? It's not even on my radar. I'm super interested in whatever, like my career or my business or this thing that I'm doing, and my hyper focus is on something that isn't sex. And then you might see a different pattern of a partner going, well, I'm busy doing all these other things and I'm not all that interested in sex. Mostly what you'll see is somebody who has a kind of a significant interest in sex, but that also can change. So if you think about how as ADHDers, there are things that grab our attention and then it kind of goes away and we're not so interested in anymore. We think about other things and then maybe that thing comes back. So there's kind of much more variation that can happen in that sexual interest as well. So if you're a partner of somebody with ADHD, it's kind of like being on that roller coaster all the time, right? And
Mhm.
now you've got like this also roller coaster that I think really applies to sex as well. Overall, what we can also see is more sexual impulsivity, more choices, sometimes that can lead to sexual consequences like unplanned pregnancies or STIs. And so those things can be extraordinarily life-changing as well. And an interest in activities and sexual activities that are novel, interesting, exciting, kink interest, more sexual contact with people regardless of gender. So some of this fluidity that I think we often see in the neurodivergent community in many different ways will also kind of seems to be coming up in regards to sexuality. So those are like the broad lines. And then we add things like sensory issues, which again, we don't often have a language to talk about that. What does that mean when you have the ick factor? And if we don't have language to talk about it and identify it, if somebody's got an ick about something and you're a partner and you don't know that, or that person doesn't know how to articulate it, we might be missing each other when it comes to really engaging sexually in a good way.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things that come to mind
Yeah.
as we start
Well,
thinking about this.
that makes a lot of sense because sensory does play a lot. And in my situation and with my spouse, he loves the sensory. He likes me to touch him. Touch is very important to him because it activates something that it doesn't activate for me. So you have to kind of watch out for those cues. But I
Yes.
completely understand what you're saying about the roller coasters, because there are just the focus and unfocus that can go. It's like tides. Some days it's like hyper sex drive. Some days is not. I can totally understand the roller coaster here.
Yeah.
But I do have
So
to ask you something though. What is the difference that you see from people that have not been diagnosed with ADHD versus someone who has been diagnosed with ADHD around sexual challenges that they have or the
uh,
problems they come to you for?
so do you mean somebody who is not diagnosed but has ADHD, but they don't know it? Or somebody who's neurotypical?
So I would say someone that hasn't been diagnosed yet and don't know they have ADHD and they're coming to see you, do they have one
Ah,
set of problems versus have one set of problems versus someone that has ADHD, has been diagnosed, and they have a different set of problems? Or
I
are
see.
they really the same?
What I see clinically is it's the same thing. I
Mhm.
think partly because we don't have language, we haven't had language to really talk about these issues. And so maybe, the person who has been diagnosed with ADHD, when I start talking about this stuff, they're like, oh, I get it. I can make those links really quickly. If you have ADHD, but you haven't been diagnosed and you don't know it, then, I'm just thinking of an example, like one of the things that might happen is somebody has gotten bored sexually, right? So they're in a relationship, they have undiagnosed ADHD, and it's not really exciting anymore. It's lost that novelty, sex is nothing is happening to keep it interesting and engaged. And so that person starts wondering, well, maybe I'm not in the right relationship, or what's wrong with me because this relationship is great, but sexually I'm not feeling it. And maybe it means I don't like them. And then there's all of these worries and anxieties that show up. When in fact, what might be going on is I'm distracted during sex. Right. So if we circle back to this idea of touch, and you're saying, okay, well, a partner that really likes touch, well, do they like hard touch? Do they like soft touch? And if it's hard touch, that's a really great way to stay grounded in your body. It's a really great way to catch your attention.
Mm,
Right. So now you're starting to do things to deal with distractibility in the bedroom. But again, without actually talking about that's what's going on, it can get really complicated. I find that people in the ADHD community are fantastic at finding creative solutions to problems. But you have to know what the problem is first. If you
mm.
don't know what the problem is, your creativity creates these really weird solutions. And you're like, really? Was that like the best solution for this right now? Whereas if you know what the problem is and you're like, okay, I get distracted during sex, then there's a whole bunch of stuff you can start thinking about that might make it a little less distracting, where you'll be able to focus a little bit more and it'll be more fun.
That makes
Hard
sense.
touch is one of those ways.
Got it.
When it comes to sexuality, your best bet, it's kind of, if you think about the work that Melissa Orlov has done around marriage and ADHD, it's
Mm,
this idea of you need to manage the ADHD symptoms. And so your first go-to is to manage your ADHD well. Now, whether that's medication for you, whether that's medication plus skills, which is typically what we recommend, you have the skills to manage the ADHD, you're doing what you need to do, then it's easier to start addressing some of these other problems. I find when it comes to sex, it's like it really is the same thing. And the research that we have around what to do about it, and there's not very much, right? There's Dr. Tuckman has done his survey, and that's really what's come out of this is if you manage your ADHD, it's going to help you have better sex. Now, from there, I think there's really these pieces around knowing what the distractibility is. identifying the sensory issues, thinking about that anxiety, managing the need for novelty and that sexual anxiety that can be there for ADHDers. So as we add the skills to that and the language and we start talking about it, I think we're going to find that there are ways to deal with this that are effective. But I think we're kind of really early, especially I don't know that there's much research that will say, if you do this, this, and this, then you can address these sexual problems. I think right now education is going to be our first line of defense, talking to people and talking about how ADHD has impacted their sex life. And I think we're going to learn a lot by having those conversations.
That's great too. That's great to hear. So going back to this higher sex drive or lower sex drive, what really causes for people with ADHD to hit those highs and lows?
That's so interesting. So, the answer, the research-based answer is we don't know why. It's like a lot of these things, we don't know why. The template I have based on my clinical experience is this idea of we need the stimming, we need to keep our brains interested, and we tend to hyper-focus on things. And so when people are hyper-focused on sex, that creates this feedback loop, which is, the similar thing to the shopping and all the other things we can get hyper-focused on. It feels really good for our brain. And sex, I think, is a very easy thing to hyper-focus on because it feels very good and orgasm is fantastic. So now you've got this thing where you're feeding your brain, it feels good, you have this tendency to hyper-focus, you start hyper-focusing on sex, and now, you're off and running. Whereas, if we think about the lows, if you're hyper-focused on business or a passion project or something else, you might then have all that attention is over there in this other thing, and you might not be engaged sexually during the time you're hyper-focused on something else. So if that makes sense to me, but I think we need to kind of keep talking about it and seeing if there's other specific mechanisms to that.
That makes sense. So when an ADHD partner has a higher sex drive than like a non-ADHD partner, what kind of emotional and relational challenges does this create for both of them?
Huge, right? Boom. It's that explosion of, do we start blaming each other, right? You don't want it enough, you want it too much. Now we're fighting about frequency. And there's nothing worse than you can do than fight about frequency, because that's not really the issue. The issue is, how do we navigate our needs? How do we find some compromise? What does that look like? And that does take a lot of conversation. I do talk about this a little bit in the ADHD and Sex workbook because it does come up a lot. And there's really two pieces to it, I think. And the first piece is this idea of, well, if we let go of counting frequency, counting number, and kind of going, well, it was 3 times this week and once last week and once last month, and we look at this more from that standpoint of the hyper-focus that I was talking about, can we look at the variations and the ways in which the frequency goes up and down? And what happens when we take that bigger picture? Is it simply that we're not having sex at all? Now, I'll talk about that in a moment, versus this idea of sometimes we have a lot of sex and sometimes we have less sex. And it depends on these other variables. It depends on what else is getting my attention in that moment or in that time frame. I think that's always going to be a more productive conversation than fighting about frequency. When you're looking at that big picture and it's not meeting your needs or your partner's needs, one of the things that always is really obvious is one person is having way more fun than the other person. And so it's not fun. It's not pleasurable. It's not play. I like to talk a lot about sex as play because I think it's one of the things that we forget, and we certainly forget about it when we're stuck in the frequency fights. This is supposed to be fun. It's something where both of us are having fun. And so if my partner's not having fun, what is happening with them? What is getting in the way of them having fun? Right? And if I'm not having fun, what's happening for me and what's getting in the way of me not having fun? And so we both have a responsibility to play and to play within our own selves and to be comfortable with this idea of play. And then we can play with somebody else. And that requires a lot of communication, and that requires a lot of getting to know that person. And if you're angry, you're not going to want to play. One example, all you have to do is go like hang out at a school, elementary school, for like 5 minutes, and you will hear like this, I don't like that. I'm not playing with you anymore. And then somebody storms off and they eventually get over it. And this is the joy of children, right?
Yes.
But I often it's that same thing that's happening in this frequency conversation. Somebody has storming off going, there's something about this I don't like. I'm not willing to play with you. And how we then rebuild from there is the work and the challenge, and needing to have two people who are wanting to rebuild from that place, finding ways to make it fun for everybody.
So you brought up some really good points, but I think from people that I've talked to or couples I've talked to, this is probably one of those topics they really try to ignore and avoid.
Yeah.
So, what are your advice around like ignoring or deferring this conversation?
Oh, it just gets so much worse, right? Deferring the conversation is just, it's like any sort of avoidance. You don't address the real problem that's going on in the relationship. It's very, very hard if you're not willing to talk about it. And it can be hard to articulate, what is it that makes it feel like it's not fun? And sometimes I think that's part of that deferring of the conversation. It's like, I know I'm not having a good time, but I really have a hard time to put into words what is making it unfun. So the more that people can do that and can try to kind of figure out like what, even if you're kind of going back into your body and getting seated in your body, you're like, what would make this unfun? And sometimes it has to do with that impulsivity. You know, the ADHD partner is really, really keen and eager, and then they just kind of blow through and everything's happening a little too fast. These are conversations that you can have once you start slowing it down and having the conversation about what might be getting in the way.
Got it. So, I think we've also kind of touched point this earlier when we were not on the interview about partners struggling with their other partner using porn because they're not getting as much. So, what do you have to share about that? Because I have talked to other non ADHD partners where if their partner is using porn, it's cheating on them, which I
Oh
find
yes. And I have a bit of an eye
interesting.
roll. Yeah. It's a very interesting perspective. And so we come back to this idea of play, right? So if sex is play and I'm playing with myself or I'm playing with somebody else, and both those things are allowed, that is an important first step. And I'd argue in regards to sexual health, right? To say to somebody, well, you can play, but you have to play in this way, or you have to play in the way that I like to play. That typically will not go over. And so then you create this whole other argument and this whole other fight about how we play and what's allowed when we play. And these are conversations where people are going to have very different perspectives and needs. And if you can't actually have the conversation and somebody goes, well, okay, fine, but I don't agree, that is a very, very dangerous place for the relationship to go. So Dealing with the sexual discrepancy problem, the sexual frequency problem is one thing. And I think it is very, very important. And we don't have any research on this, but it'd be really interesting to know whether this happens more in an ADHD, non-ADHD partnership situation. Gut tells me that's probably really quite possible, but we don't have anything to, to say that for sure. It's going to be an important piece of these online courses I'm working on because I want to make sure that we have space to talk about that appropriately. When you have that problem and then you add this other problem, which is we're not going to want sex at the same amount of frequency, we're not going to want sex the same amount of time, and you can't masturbate using porn. Now you're painting your partner into this corner where they have less and less options in which to get their needs met. And that typically can lead to really negative things in the relationship. So whether now there's more anger and there's more resentment, or that maybe eventually there's an affair because the person goes, well, I can't do this and I can't do that. So now what? And that edgy, kind of cranky, and all the conflicts that come from that. It's almost like you're taking one problem, and instead of dealing with this one and finding a nice way out, we're just lapping on one other problem. And now those two problems together can really create that big explosion.
Yeah. I really like the way that you have explained it, where you are limiting your partner of how to do certain things, kind of taking control out of what they can and cannot do, which nobody wants, even if you take sex out of the way.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to tell my husband how to do the dishes. He doesn't like that. So I don't like people telling me how I need to do the dishes. I guess this is exactly how it plays when it comes to a topic like porn, but it really requires a couple's having a conversation of dealing with this together.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the analogy I think is a really good one, right? If you try to tell your husband, this is how you have to do the dishes because this is how I do it, they're either going to stop doing the dishes, they're going to be mad when they do the dishes. They might eventually, they might do it your way, but they're not going to be happy about it. And then there's all these other negative feelings that grow. Using porn is like many other things. It's a choice. It's a choice that we have. If you have concerns about the fact that the hyper focus on sex is being enhanced by the porn use, then I think that's a bit of a different conversation. I'm really concerned that you're hyper focused on sex. I would prefer that you are hyper focused on other areas of our lives. What can we do with this? But I think blaming that on porn and saying that porn is the reason you're hyper-focused versus I have ADHD and that's the reason I'm hyper-focused would lead to very different outcomes of those conversations.
Got it. Do you have any kind of like tips or exercises that can help people kind of have this conversation? Because people are shy. Having this conversation sometimes can be super, super hard. Any recommendations?
It's interesting how often that question comes up, actually. And I think because I've been in sexual health for so long, I'm like, well, you would just have the conversation. But it is important to have the right time, right? So, is your partner hyper-focused on something right now, or is it a good time? Sometimes partners enjoy having a bit of a heads up. Hey, I'd like to talk to you about this, thing, this aspect of our lives, and we haven't talked about it much before. When would be a good time? Or can we talk about it at this day? Having privacy, obviously, for the conversation and space. But I think most importantly, it's being curious. Going in with a sense of curiosity and wanting to learn about your partner, from your partner, and having them reciprocate that same curiosity of really wanting to learn and understand what makes you tick. And if you offer curiosity and interest, and your partner can offer that back, then these conversations, even if it takes, we're going to try to have the conversation, maybe it takes 10 times that we like slowly dip into this. But coming at it with curiosity is, I think, the best way to try to get that conversation going.
That makes a lot of sense. Not going in there with any agenda in mind,
Yes.
just about learning about why
Yeah.
does your partner like to do certain things?
Yeah.
Is it
Yeah.
very important to them? Those are being curious is going to help you both understand each other better and then finding common ground.
And, asking a question and getting, I don't know, is actually really helpful. If you don't know something and your partner's curious about an aspect of your sexuality or how you feel about X, Y, and Z, and you don't know, and you just say, I don't know. Now, all of a sudden, we can go into this process of finding out together or exploring something together. You're not going to know if you like strawberry ice cream if you've never tried it. But having that conversation and knowing that the answer is I don't know gives you more different options than if you are saying, well, I have to pick yes or no, so I guess I'll pick one of the two. And that your conversation isn't actually genuine and honest about where you're at either.
That is true.
Yeah.
Because your experience could change over time and your preference can change over time.
Yes.
Just like with food, same thing
Yes.
could happen with sex. So having an
Absolutely.
open mind for it. Great.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your workbook.
Oh, well, so I had so much fun. As you can tell, this is all a passion project, right? This was a lot of fun. So this is the workbook. It's the ADHD and Sex workbook, and I wanted it to be a workbook so people could use it, ask questions, answer questions for themselves, not be in this space. I know it's so hard to find mental health professionals, and it can be, difficult to find somebody that works well with you and expensive and all of these things. And I really wanted to bring this knowledge so that we could start the conversation. What I love about it is that it's dense. What people find about it is like, oh my goodness, how did you write so many things about ADHD and sex? I'm like, I just kept going on and on and on. And so there's a lot of like lines. It's not all text, I promise. But so this is the workbook that came out, and I'm really, as you can tell, very excited about it, wanting people to kind of use it as they can. You can take different chapters, so each chapter is not necessarily going to be relevant to you. You can kind of hop around in it and find the things that speak to you. And I'm also running the educational courses. So if you're kind of looking at the workbook and going, oh, no, in typical ADHD fashion, no, I'd rather just, kind of sit down and have you talk me through this stuff, then there's options for that as well. And really the whole goal of this is for people in the ADHD community to have a place where they can talk about sexuality and not get feedback that is neurotypical in approach or neurotypical in expectation, just really from this place of, okay, as a neurodivergent person, this is what my sex life is. So how are we going to work with this? Rather than, well, it should be this or it should be that. I think we get that in so many aspects of our lives, how we are supposed to dress and how we are supposed to work and the lifestyle we're supposed to hold. And we've had that same thing in regards to our sexuality. And so having a place to talk about that, ADHDsex.com is like a website I've put together because I want us to have a hub. I want us to have a place where we can come together and get information and share information and be there for each other in a way that I just don't think we've had very easily when it comes to sex. So that's the idea.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. So for those people that wants to work with you and contact you, what is the best way to reach out to you?
The educational courses are at ADHDsex.com. And so all that information is there. I can't, as a psychologist, I can only work with people who are in my area because of licensing things. And so offering psychological services for the most part is not something I can do unless you happen to live in British Columbia. But outside of that, the coursework and the workbook is really meant to teach and to allow people to work with the concepts, learn the concepts, and then figure out what works for them. And I think that is a really good place for our community to move in all the different areas, right? Whether we're talking about ADHD in finances or ADHD in marriage, ADHD in sex. And I think the more time goes on, there's going to be more and more of these areas where we can learn neurodivergent strategies to improve our lives, and having more discussion about that on a whole bunch of levels. It is
Great.
our superpower.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lynn.
I'm
It
so
was great to
glad.
have this conversation with you.
It's lovely to be here, and I really appreciate getting to chat and catch up. This was really fun.